This will be part 3 of my video series discussing slavery in the Bible. Right now I'm in the middle of discussing slavery in the Old Testament, and I'm looking at some specific passages that seem to cause issues or problems when discussing the issue of slavery in the Bible. Specifically right now dealing with Leviticus chapter 25 verses 44 through 46, and I want to pick up where I left off. Now, if a skeptic defines slavery as non-consensual ownership, I find it ironic that they would use this passage. If a Hebrew is buying a slave, the question is who's doing the selling? It has to be the slave, because if someone else is doing the selling, then this is considered kidnapping, and kidnapping was punishable by death, Exodus 21 verse 16. So the slave or the slave's family is doing the selling, which means this is a voluntary act, not non-consensual ownership. This passage, when read and interpreted in context, actually hurts the skeptic's argument. To begin with, God orders the Israelites to make a distinction between Hebrew servants and those of foreign nations. Now, the distinction is only really made in regards to certain Hebrew laws, such as the dietary, interest, and debt laws, which wouldn't apply to foreigners unless, of course, foreigners assimilated and became Israelites, which may have been very common. The Israelites were, according to Leviticus 25 verses 44 through 46, the Israelites were, number one, allowed to buy, not take slaves from foreign nations around them. And it's important to note that this would not include the Canaanites, but would be from remote or foreign lands or foreign nations. This would make the incident level of this extremely small, except in the case of royalty and the ruling class. And in those days, rulers were would often have slaves with special skills, such as writing, teaching, translation. But the lives of these slaves would not be representative of what we understand common Western slavery to be. Point 2. The temporary resident situation would look more like the Hebrew institution, since the alien would be selling himself in this case. The main difference would be that the absence of the time or lease freedom clauses. But the slave for life situation may not have been what was behind "you can make them slaves for life," implying that it was not automatic. Number 3, the temporary resident already performed more mundane tasks for the people, for example, the wood and the water services. Deuteronomy chapter 29 verse 11 states that the aliens living in your camps who chop your wood and carry your water. In exchange for escape, the temporary resident situation is in exchange for escape from Egypt or other troubled foreign lands. These aliens were not confined to some lower class in the Israelite assembly, since it's obvious they could rise to affluence and actually buy slaves themselves, even Hebrew slaves, according to Leviticus 25 verses 47 through 55 as well. Finally, it should be noted that the passage says that they can make them slaves for life, not that they were automatically slaves for life. Somehow freedom was the default and lifetime slavery was only an option. It doesn't appear that this was automatic, but under these circumstances the master had a permanent obligation. The master had a permanent obligation to care for the slave and his offspring. It should also be recognized that the law did make some allowance for the less than ideal practices in the day, for example, polygamy and divorce, but nevertheless regulated these practices and placed definite limits and protections around these areas. The foreign semi-slavery seems to have fallen into this category as well. Furthermore, like modern-day contracts, the permanence was as great an emphasis on the obligation of the master, more so than the slave. The master had a permanent obligation to provide for the slave, and in some cases the slave's children. But even with this class of people being considered below regular Hebrew slaves, there was still a God-directed humanitarian vision required of Israel, in strong contradiction to the other lands. And the provisions in the law to keep it voluntary is in strict opposition to how skeptics define and describe slavery in the Old Testament. Now I want to turn my attention to another skeptic favorite. We're still discussing entry. In discussing entry, I want to turn to Exodus chapter 21 verses 1 through 11. I'm going to begin by looking at the first 6 verses. I'll quote. Genesis 21 verses 1 through 6 states, "Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, and I will not go free, Then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Now, dealing with these passages, clearly these verses deal with Hebrew slaves. And according to the Jewish Study Bible, most slaves of this type were domestic servants. Now, I want to make a few quick points here. First of all, looking at verse 2, it should be very clear that slavery is not forever. And if a master mistreated the servant still had the escape clauses. Remember the escape clauses? If the servant was mistreated by his master, the servant was granted freedom. Exodus 21, verses 26 through 27. Now, specifically looking at verses 5 and 6, clearly, again, these laws deal with Hebrew slaves. Most of the Hebrew slave arrangements were limited to 6 years in length. This is also according to Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 12. Continuation of the relationship was possible, but only as a strictly voluntary act of the slave. Therefore, to ensure that this was a voluntary act, a ceremony took place which included an ear piercing. Again, this is a voluntary act on part of the slave. This is not, as some skeptics like to describe, a branding of a cow. This is someone who is volunteering to go through a ceremony to remain with a certain Hebrew household, much like today when people get tattoos to show a belonging to a certain type of group or organization. This piercing ceremony was about the slave's desire to belong to a certain Hebrew household, not the master declaring permanent ownership as in cattle. It needs also to be pointed out that even though the slave went through the ceremony, all the escape clauses still applied. So if the relationship soured, the slave still could go free. Again, revisit Exodus 21, verses 26 through 27, Deuteronomy 15:12, and Deuteronomy, as we've already discussed, the Great Escape Clause, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 15. Now, I will come back to verses 1 through 4 here in a little bit, but before I do, I'd like to read the rest of the passage, verses 7 through 11. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 7 through 11 says, "And if a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her for a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of the daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. And if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go free without paying any money." Now, I would like to begin by saying that this passage is not about sex. I know a lot of skeptics say this is about sexual slavery. It is not. This passage is about marriage. Now, before I deal with verses 1 through 4 and verses 7 through 11, I want to review and explain the marriage process of the Old Testament. First of all, marriages in the Old Testament were arranged. Okay? Now, I'm going to be discussing the process of getting married for normal folks. Okay? First of all, the parents of the two families discussed and agreed on the marriage union between their respective son and daughter in the context of a union of families, not of individuals. Number 2, a moher, that's spelled M-O-H-A-R, or a payment is made by the father of the groom to the father of the bride. Remember, this is the process for the free people, which was usually equivalent to 5 years of labor. After the marriage, number 3, after the marriage, in return for the moher, a payment of some kind was made by the father of the bride to the father of the groom, called the dowry of the girl. Basically, marriages were arranged and money exchanged hands. Now, I'm going to pick up with Exodus 21, verses 7 through 11 in my next video. Thank you.